Hi, everyone, and welcome to Marketing Your Podcast. I am Michelle Cobb, Executive Director of the Podcast Academy. I will say it again, and I've said it before. If you have a question for our speaker, please put it into the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box, so we keep good track of it. The Podcast Academy is a new organization for individual podcasters. And we have a very special opening price of membership, just $50 a year. And you get access to all these free webinars, which as of October will not be available widely to the public, but only to our members. The price goes up to $100 tomorrow. And in mid-October, we will be taking submissions for our awards, which are all very top secret right now, but we'll be coming out with more information about those in the next 2 weeks. All right, I hope you follow us on LinkedIn and on Twitter at Podcast Academy. And now it's my pleasure to introduce one of our board members. Christy Mirabal is Vice President of Marketing Podcasting at SonyMusic Entertainment, and she's Treasurer of the Podcast Academy. She oversees all strategic marketing, including planning, development, and execution of initiatives to drive branding and awareness to Sony Music's podcast projects. And she's been in podcasting for a while. She was at Stitcher and at Panoply. And she has done a lot of things that she's going to tell us about today. So I will turn it over to her and just remind everyone that you can put your questions in. She will be taking them throughout, but please put them into the Q&A box, not the chat box. All right, Christy, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. I'm super excited to be here today. Apologies in advance. I do actually tend to talk a little fast. Usually I kind of joke it's because I'm so energetic and I'm so excited to kind of talk about marketing and podcasts. But if for whatever reason, if I do talk a little fast, just shoot, a question and Michelle will kind of just say, hey, can you repeat that? And I'm more than happy to do so. As Michelle mentioned, I have been in the podcast space very specifically for about 6 years now. I come to it as somebody who's been listening to podcasts since they were actually in the educational part of iTunes. And I think this first moment that I saw that actually I could kind of take my media career and kind of poured it over into podcasting, I did it just because I love the medium so much and it's brought me such great joy. Kind of fun fact, I think one of the first podcasts that got me really into it, and I still listen to it off and on, is the Slate Political Gabfest. And I kind of, I don't know, I still love listening to it because it brings me such joy because it really has, I think, it's the reason why I'm here today. So what I wanted to do was just kind of walk through some of the questions that I had gotten ahead of this this webinar, and I kind of drafted this deck and what I'm about to talk about based around those questions. That said, as Michelle mentioned, I'm more than happy to kind of pivot. I'm more than happy to dig into things deeper as things kind of come up. The other thing I'll kind of say before I launch is that some of the questions that I got back, I think were more from producers that are probably doing that thing where you do all the things, where you're doing the production and the editing and the marketing and all that kind of stuff, right? So there's other people I know in the academy that aren't maybe, kind of operating that way. And so again, just ask a lot of questions. I'm happy to dig in deeper where there's value. So with that, I'm going to get started. Whoops. Why is that part not working? There we go. All right, so just some stuff that we're going to go over. Something I talk a lot about, mostly because I get a lot of questions about this, is that, what do you do if you have a big budget? What do you do if you have a small budget? What do you do if there's like a international, or if you're launching a new market or anything like that? And really what I always kind of come back to is that it's about the fundamentals. So we're going to go over some things that I think about as a marketer in terms of how I actually get started on almost every single show that I've launched. We're going to talk about why art is so important and cannot wait until the very last second when you're thinking about a show. We're going to talk about an audience development framework for you to kind of think about in terms of when you're launching a show, or even when you're trying to just grow a show, what are some different buckets and some different strategies that you can be thinking about to pull forward. Also get a lot of questions about budgets and KPIs, so we're going to cover that, and then I'll go over some more tactical stuff that I think is pretty important in the overall audio space. It does likely have some questions. Should I pause or kind of keep going? Keep going. All right. So let's start with demographics. If I had a penny for every single time I've been told when I ask the question, oh, this show sounds so great, like who do you think is going to kind of come to this? And then I get the answer, everybody will like the show, I'd probably be pretty rich. the answer is not usually everybody is going to like every single show, right? Like you are making a show for somebody very specific. You know, it's kind of like the thing that sometimes you hear Hollywood people say, it's a 4-quadrant sort of thing. Not everything can be Jurassic Park. And the smarter you are, and the more specific you are about understanding your listener, and who you're actually making for the show for, the more you can actually kind of build out something that's going to actually help you understand where are you going to go find more people like that listener that you've got in the back of your head. And so the things that I kind of start with, you know, and I should also add too that, like, yes, being at Sony Music, I have a lot of resources in terms of like our research and insights team, right? That said, though, I've also been an independent podcaster producer myself, where I have had none of the tools, right? And so I want to kind of just, you know, put this out there that what I'm about to kind of go through, you can do just by Googling, right? It takes some time. I spent a lot of time over the years actually digging around in fun census info to try to actually dig into things more, but I just don't want it to kind of seem like, oh, this is only stuff that some of the bigger companies can pull off. This is stuff that I've done, you know, throughout my entire sort of, you know, media career. But usually when I'm thinking about either from like a production standpoint or from a marketing standpoint, I start with like the basics, right? Because I gotta have some of the major stuff before I can kind of really make it more specific, right? So your standard stuff, like, what's the age range, right? Like, again, not everybody is going to be listening. I also think you have to be smart about, like, not only is who is your listener, right? Who's your program being kind of designed for, but also who's listening to podcasts right now. Those two things actually kind of have to meld together, because if you're trying to design something or produce something for, I don't know, I'm going to make something up, but for like a 95-year-old Midwestern, you know, who doesn't have internet service, maybe that's going to be a hard target to kind of find in podcasting, right? So it's both who the show is for, but also who is kind of listening to podcasts. Those are kind of two important things to pull together. You know, gender may or may not matter, you know what I mean? But it is something I'm at least thoughtful of, in terms of, like, you know, what the production is like, where are they living, you know, and whatnot, right? So all of those kind of basic, you know, details are much more about the demographic, and that's all good data to have, right? But what you want to actually start doing then is taking some of those demographic stuff and then actually developing a persona or an avatar. You want to take something that, like, you know, is a little bit more broad and make it much more specific. I think it's important. I think it's really helpful. And I've gone as far as actually at previous jobs, when I'm working on like kind of one thing, I'll take that persona on my wall and I think about that person every single day. Every single thing that I do is, like, either as a producer or as a marketer, has to serve that person. And it's just always kind of like a really good, important touchstone for me in terms of everything that I do as a marketer, right? I'm going to show you an example in a second, but the other thing I'll point out is that if you're pre-launch, you may go into it with the best of intentions. You may think that you're, you know, that you've got, that you know who your listener is going to be. You've developed your persona. And, like, I've worked on some shows where, like, it's wrong, right? Like, we went into it thinking it was going to be, you know, 25 to 34-year-old females. And all of a sudden we figured out that like 30% of the audience was actually males, right? That's not right or wrong, right? It means that they're liking the show. What it does mean, though, is that your audience and your persona and your avatars actually need to change along the way to kind of match with what you're finding out, like, in real time. So it's not like one of these things where, like, you do it, you know what I mean, and then you never touch it again, right? Or, you know, you do it and then suddenly you're getting data and you're like, did I do something wrong? It's just one of those things that, like, as your show grows, as it progresses, this is something that should kind of, you know, go along with that. And then the kind of thing, and I'll kind of show you an example on the next page. But again, all the stuff that I'm about to show you in the next page, I got from Googling. I can find case studies. I go into census data. I go into, like, there's so many white papers of other people that have done all the legwork for you that I just piggyback off of it, right? If you're trying to reach like a millennial audience, then Google millennial audiences, because a lot of people will have written white papers that I can guarantee you can crib stuff from, right? So here, is an example of something that, don't get too caught up. Like, I was even laughing last night when I was looking at this, because I mentioned, you know, downloads music from iTunes. Who does that now? This is something that that I actually did 8 years ago, so I didn't feel that bad about sharing this. But you know, what I was working on was actually a product that that was for you know, the female baby boomer, basically, right? All of this that is basically this data that's in here. Again, I did not have access to any of the stuff that I now do at Sony Music. This is literally me crawling through and spending, I'd say, literally probably about 4 hours on Google one night trying to figure out like who can I actually call that female baby boomer and make her real, right? So Susan became my audience, you know, avatar basically. And again, I taped her up actually on my wall at the time when I had an office when we could still do that. And so I built her out so that she became like an actual real person. And what I find useful about this exercise is it takes something like very amorphous, like I'm trying to reach like the female baby boomers, right? It makes it real so that I can think like, okay, either I can kind of have a sense of where I think Susan is spending time and how else I can kind of reach other Susans, or I can actually back into starting to again kind of Google and figure out like, okay, you know, Susan is a baby boomer, you know, she has children. Where are people in this age range actually spending time, right? And it just kind of helps me again be much more specific with what I can do from a marketing perspective. This is one of those things that I see a lot of people skip over this point. They go right from, I've got the show, now I got to go and I got to market it. So the only thing I can kind of say is this is a really critically important step that honestly, I feel like actually should be part of like the production process. But if nothing else, you need to be doing this so that you actually understand where you're going with your marketing plans. So I'm going to pause and just make sure, because I'm going to flip to something else if there's any questions on the persona or avatars.
Yes. So someone was asking, how did you get data post-launch? You know, you've got this avatar. Are there platforms other than Spotify that provide demo data that can help you with this?
Yeah, that's rough, right? I literally was on a call right before this where I was like, man, it's been 6 years of me just being like, data and podcasting sucks. It does, right? It just does. And I'm very used to it now at this point. But sometimes, you know, now that I work at a music company, they tell me all the stuff they can tap into. And I'm like, man, if I even had a tenth of what you did, I'd be so much better at my job. But it's just not the world we live in. So listener surveys are still something that are an incredibly important tool that you should be using to actually get more data. And so you can kind of go into the stuff that I talked about on the other page, right? In terms of like, you know, the kind of demographic information. Ask them what else they're listening to. Where else are they spending time? Any kind of question that you are thinking about that you wish you knew more about is what you should include in those listener surveys. Sometimes I find like when I hear them, they are so sales focused or so kind of like you're just getting like 3 questions. And I would just encourage you, the people that are going to take that survey, they want to help you, right? That's why they're taking the survey. So don't be afraid of like, no, don't ask for 20 minutes of their time to take a survey because like nobody has time for that. But like, you know, can you ask more than 3 questions? Yes, you can. Yeah, I would say that that's probably been where I tap into the most when I can't actually get stuff from the actual platforms themselves. So, yeah.
And someone was asking, what are good websites to find data specifically on baby boomers?
Who knew my 8-year-old example would be so prescient? Honestly, I'd have to kind of go back and redo it, but I'm telling you, man, it's just Googling. You know, there are so many marketing firms and advertising firms and sales. Like there are so many people whose bread and butter it is to kind of write white papers to basically say like, look, we know this audience and like whatever, that I have no shame in like going in and like digging through there and trying to figure out what I can basically kind of take and take for myself, right? So yeah, I don't have a good example for like the female baby boomers other than I can tell you like Google white papers, right? White papers, baby boomers, advertising, media segments, just like some kind of, you know, keywords basically. And I guarantee you're going to find a wealth of information. Be careful, right? I do think that, you know, this would be a classic example of like, you know, be careful of the dates is what I would say, because patterns change and they actually change pretty quickly. You know what I mean? And so like even down to like the downloading music, nobody does that anymore. Right. So like be careful how old the white papers are or where that source of information is coming from. Same thing with the census, right? We're kind of coming up to the tail end of the census. And so you have to kind of at least keep that in the back of your mind about like, you know, how useful that data is actually going to be. But yeah, I think just kind of some random Googling gets me pretty far. So yeah.
All right, so we have a great question here. If you're finding that you are 60% female, 40% male, would you recommend creating 2 avatars and approaches?
Yes, I would. Especially if you can get even more data, right, on your listeners. You know, if, I'm assuming this is coming from post-launch, right? If you can get even more data, they're totally 2 different people. For what it's worth, so this actually came from something that I did when I spent many years in book publishing. That's what I did before I started in podcasting. And so I actually did this for Harper Audio. And so this is one of, I think, 6 audience personas that I developed for Harper Audio. Now, again, this was like, I don't know, 8-10 years ago somewhere at this point, but like yeah, so it wasn't one, it was like one of many. Sometimes that works, right? Sometimes it doesn't. If you have more of a general interest show, like one where there's a 60-40 split, that's a perfect example of where you probably have at least two. You know, whereas if you're more concise, right, if you have a very niche audience you're trying to reach, one might actually get you pretty far, right? So it really kind of depends on what show you're producing. Yeah.
Great. We've got a lot of questions coming in now. So someone asks, which universal link service are you using?
We use a mix actually, because of the way that Sony is kind of set up. And so I'm not going to use the one that's on the music side because honestly, it's too music. It looks even music, and I don't like it. But I do use Chartable. What I like about Chartable is that they understand the podcast space, and I think they're doing really smart things with marketing attribution that as a marketer I really love. And so yeah, that's what we've been using is Chartable.
Okay, is there a Swiss knife kind of tool for podcast marketing? Let's say for the small retailer, that might be Facebook. Is there anything equivalent for podcasting?
No, I mean, I'll go into some tactics that kind of work for everybody, right? And they're kind of like the tried and true stuff. And I guess in that sense, it might be the Swiss Army knife. You know, and kind of what I mean by that is almost anything in audio is going to get you much further from an ROI perspective than trying to get people not currently listening to listen to audio. I think it gets better every year, but I can still think of friends, like literal friends that, you know, that want to do me a solid and help me with my career, that when I told them that I had a podcast launching like 4 years ago, they'd be like, I don't know, that sounds like really techie or sounds really hard or whatever it is. And every year it gets a little easier, but yeah, it's just a lot easier to convert people who are already listening to podcasts to listen to yours than it is to try to get somebody new into the kind of overall ecosystem. So yeah.
Well, that sort of takes us right into this question. Where can we find the latest data on overall podcast listenership, say from 2019 or even 2020? And can we drill down to identify listenership by state or region?
Ugh, don't you wish? No, I don't know.
I do wish.
Yeah, I don't think that there's anything by state or region. Edison is usually kind of the forebearer, I think, in all of like the major, and all that stuff, by the way, is easily findable, right? It's not behind a paywall. So I would just Google Edison, and they have multiple studies that come out, you know, throughout the year. But share of ear is generally where I kind of go. I would say that like there are some white papers though, that I know, like, so for example, Megaphone has done some, where they'll kind of dig into more of like the states, I would say. And then, you might actually, I've not done this myself, but you might actually be able to play around with Facebook's paid platform and try to back into some interesting things that way. One thing that is always interesting to me is that you can actually, I'm going to turn off that dingy sound in a second, sorry. But you can actually target podcasts as an interest. And so what you might actually be able to do, although you're going to have to kind of hack your way there, is play around with basically the paid tool to start figuring out the podcast interest and then some maybe other targeting that's in there, and then start looking at like the state-by-state representation. So that might be a hacky way to get there too.
Great, and I'll just reiterate, that's Edison Research and the Share of Ear Survey. They do a lot of great work for audio, for radio, for podcasting, and audiobooks as well. So they give you a very good idea of what's happening in the market.
Yeah. Sorry.
It's all right, she's turning off that ding.
Yeah, but I also lost my screen here.
Well, we do have some comments that you do actually speak very fast. And
sorry, I apologize for that.
I will have to work on putting together a transcript of this, but we will have the video up on the site as it stands later this week, and I will pursue the transcript option. And speaking of transcripts, someone wants to know, are they a good idea for every episode, and do they help you get traffic to your podcast?
Depends how you use them. You know, it's amazing kind of how much of a sticky wicket I think transcripts are in podcasting, because I think, you know, there's the doing the right thing for people that maybe can't listen in the way that, you know, podcasts are kind of set up. But then there are also other people that it's like, well, if we give you all in a transcript, are you actually going to listen to the audio? And then if you monetize in the audio and then it's in the transcript and you only read the transcript and then you don't hear the ad, well then how, you know what I mean? It's like this very vicious sort of circle that I feel like a lot of people have a lot of opinions on. on. But to answer the question in terms of can it help people find your podcast? Yeah, because if you do something and you put it on your website, right, that is going to help people. It's an SEO play, right? It's basically an SEO play to kind of drive traffic towards your podcast. So, but if you just kind of do it and don't, I don't know, or like put it in the show notes, I've seen that kind of happen before. Like that's not the best use of transcripts when it comes to SEO. That's what I would say.
And what is, since you said website, what is critical to have on a podcast website?
It depends on the show. I've designed websites where I've made them a destination, right? Your show has to have enough information. It has to have kind of enough of there to have more context there for people to want to spend time there, right? So like an example, like I worked on revisionist history, right? Like, we did a lot to make sure that like everything that Malcolm talked about in like an episode, we built a whole world around it, right? There was a lot of different like resources and touch points and stories and like pictures and like whatever, right? That's a destination. That's something that if you're really into that show, you're going to want to go to that site and you're going to want to kind of live there, right? By and large, though, I'm not sure that I worked on a lot of shows where that's the kind of experience that one might actually have. Because at the end of the day, if you're kind of Googling something and you find something cool, you just want to listen to it. And are you going to listen to it on the website, or are you going to want to listen to it on the podcatcher that you're actually already kind of into and using, right? And so at the very basic level, the first thing I think about is what when somebody comes to this website, what do they want to do? And what they want to do usually, hopefully, if I've done my job correctly, is listen to the audio, right? So just get them to where they want to listen to the audio, right? Use smart links, put the retailers there. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. Make sure that there's a trailer there, make sure that like they can sample the audio, but like your job is to get them to where they want to be to do the thing you want them to do. And 9 times out of 10, it's to listen to the audio on the podcatcher of their choice. So, yeah, but again, it kind of goes back to how the show is set up.
So we have a couple questions about transcripts because you say don't put them in the show notes. So where?
Well, I would say that it's not don't put them in the show notes, although I don't know that I've really ever come across anybody that's like kind of digging through all the different show notes. Right. There is some SEO-ness that kind of goes on Apple, right? In terms of putting things in the show notes that will help people find your podcast. But is it going to help you in terms of like Google and SEO? And if you have this really great podcast about baby boomers downloading music from iTunes, right? Well, then you're not going to be found, because the only way you're going to be found if you put it in your show notes are people that are actually already in the ecosystem, right? And so you're missing out on anybody else who might actually just be kind of like Googling and tooling around there. So I wouldn't say no. I think it's kind of a personal choice, but I would just question the efficacy of it and probably where else it could live that's more powerful.
So let's take a little moment and talk a little bit about recommendations on discoverability in SEO, since that keeps coming up.
Is it more about like the podcatchers and SEO, or? Yeah. I mean, if I'm honest, it's still pretty rudimentary, right? Like, and I'm not even sure anybody's really gone on record, or any of the major podcatchers have gone on record and saying like, this is how people like use, the platform to kind of discover the podcast. However, just through kind of trial and error, and I could be wrong on that. Like, I think you could probably Google Apple and try to, see some things or suss some things out there. But I think through trial and error, it's like, there's a little bit of a hierarchy, at least certainly in Apple, in terms of where metadata kind of appears and then how your show is going to surface based on that metadata, right? So it's going to be your title, then your subtitle, then the show description, and then the episode description. I will warn you, people have tried this before. If you start keyword stuffing any of that stuff, right? Like none of the DSPs like it, or I should say podcatchers like it. And so sometimes we get some comments on that, right? Like that's not the game any more than it is on Google, right? Keyword stuffing is bad. That's a not great tactic when it comes to marketing. What Google wants and what Apple wants is they want to make really great content. And they want to surface that, or they want you to make really great content, and then they want to help get that content to the people that really want to love it, right? And keyword stuffing does not serve that purpose. So, but don't bury the lead, right? Like, so what I would say in terms of SEO is sometimes I find with producers, they're trying to be so clever with how they title things that you bury the lead. If like, I don't know, if President Obama is on your podcast, like literally the first 2 words in that podcast episode better be President Obama, right? Because there's both the SEO-ness of it, but there's also like, you have to imagine, and I almost kind of wish I'd have brought this up on my phone ahead of time, but there's also like how people just interact with the podcast apps, and there's character limits, right? So like, sorry. I should have had a good example for this on the fly, but I'm looking up one now. I don't know, this is not going to work, me trying to do on fly, but basically there are character cutoffs, right? And so if you do like, sometimes I'll see this thing where like in the metadata, it's like, you'll see like a show that has like 50 different episodes, and every episode in the episode description starts, this week we talk about, and then it cuts off, right? And then you'll see the entire page on like iTunes or like on your phone that says, in this week we talk about, right? That is not adding value to the listener. That is not helping the listener find the thing that they are going to want to kind of listen to on your show, right? Vary it up and make sure that you don't bury the lead and that you say, President Obama talks to us this week about blah, 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 right? So yeah, like I would just think about the hierarchy, right? Don't bury the lead. Don't do the like, so we are launching our first music podcast, right? So I can kind of be public about this now. And what I wouldn't want to do is like, we talk about, we talk about Ricky Martin and more, right? Don't do the and more. Actually say who else is going to be on the show, because again, that's what's actually going to help people discover your content. So when they type in Ricky Martin, then they find you. But then when they talk about the next artist, they also find you, right? Just be very thoughtful and don't be too clever with your descriptions, because 9 times out of 10, people don't spend enough time looking at those things to get the joke you're trying to make. So.
All right, well, I'm going to encourage you to go back to your slides. We've got a ton more questions, but I think some of them are answered in the slides. So.
All right. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the art, just because it is one of those things where I find sometimes that people are thinking about it at the very last second, and you cannot think about it at the very last second. It is one of the most important things you can actually think about when you are launching a show, because nobody is going to hear your podcast if they don't want to click on it, right? And people, people are not going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what the show actually means. So when you are thinking about art, you really, really have to overthink it and tie it back to those audience avatars. What is Susan, that baby boomer, what is she going to kind of as she's flipping through all the things that one flips through, I don't care if it's on social media or Apple Podcasts or whatever it is, right? We're all scrolling and it's all real quick, right? What is the thing that is going to make Susan stop and pay attention to that podcast, right? That is what this art has to do, right? And so it's not a last minute thing. It is one of those things that has to get baked in from the very beginning. And it's also may have to get refreshed based on maybe you thought, again, goes back to that audience avatar and how it might have switched. If you're finding out that things are kind of shifting a little bit, your art might need a refresh too, right? In terms of your listener demographic. But, I would also say too, and I'll go to the next slide. When I'm thinking about art, the first thing I do is actually do a competitive analysis, right? So again, if I'm going to do, this one is true crime, but if I'm going to try to do a baby boomer podcast for Susan, I am actually going to see what are other podcasts that the Susans of the world are kind of listening to, right? And there's a little bit of a game that you want to play, right? Because if it's too out there, and if people with very fractured attentions are kind of flipping through things, if it doesn't feel like other things that Susan might have seen, she's going to gloss over it. On the same token, you want it to pop, right? So there's this little fine line of so the example I have here is true crime podcasts, right? If you spend enough time looking at true crime podcasts, you'll notice there's a lot of black, white, and red. And so, there's that fine line of do you want to lean into the black, white, and red because that's what kind of feels familiar in that true crime space? Or do you want to be like Moms and Murder, right? Which is where my eyes go. If I'm looking at these two things, it pops, right? And it might actually work for them too, because I feel that the color palette and whatnot, exactly what the show's going to be. The color palette kind of works for the audience demographic, and it does pop, right? But do spend the time to do a competitive analysis and figure out what is the space that you're playing in, so you can actually understand how to stand out. And it's both within the podcast world, but also wherever else you're going to actually be promoting your podcast, right? Because if you go outside of the podcast space and now you're talking about social media or whatever it is, now you have to stand amongst that sort of crowd too, right? And just remember the same behavior that we all go through when we're looking at Twitter and Facebook, or I don't care what platform it is, where you're just kind of flipping through looking for interesting things. Everybody does that, right? So your job is to figure out how do you get somebody to slow down and actually read the copy, and then they're going to go to the podcast, right? So this is not a thing, and I'm just going to keep going back to this. You cannot half-ass this. This has to be a very important part of your overall show launch and process, because no one is going to hear the audio if you don't do this part justice. So
makes sense.
Yeah. Any questions on the actual art process? No.
Nope.
Okay. So the other thing that I find too is again, you have to think about what are the things that are going to get people to actually listen to the audio, right? And so now you're talking about visuals, right? Because I don't care what kind of tactics we're talking about. I don't care if it's social media or, display or, whatever it is. It's a visually based medium that's going to lead them to the podcast, right? And the number of times or the number of shows that I've worked on as a marketer where I'm like, man, if you guys would have just gotten like one picture when you were out in the field, like, on that interview with that really crazy guy or like whatever, man, I could have made a really great video for that. Or like, man, if you would have just gotten like that, like any sort of B-roll because you got like this really great celebrity like in the studio or whatever, and like that'd be great for social media. But okay, I'll use a quote card instead. You have to be thinking about these things as you're actually out producing the show. The two examples I'll give you, it's not that the one on the right is bad, right? It's just kinetic text, right? That's a lot of like certainly what I kind of resort to when I don't have a lot of underlying assets to use, and I can make a really great trailer video using kinetic text. I'm very used to that now. But is it more powerful if I can actually, do something like that's on the left and use that for either a trailer or a social media post or whatever it is, because that tells a story more, and you're like, who is that guy? That looks kind of creepy. Like, I want to find out more. You are naturally going to stop people in their tracks with something that is on the left than you are on the right. And that requires you thinking about these things every single time you are getting tape. So whether it's like you're out in the field and you're doing something, whether it's like something I've done in the past is like if I can't actually, set up video cameras like in the actual studio, what I'll do is I'll make sure I'll carve out 10 minutes at the very end with every guest that I kind of brought in and have them recreate some moments that I think would work really well, in social media. I do it that way because I don't want to pause them in the moment. I don't want to interrupt the flow or whatever it is, but I also want to get something that'll help me bring, traffic to the overall podcast itself. Just use your phone, right? It doesn't have to be great. It doesn't have to be polished. It doesn't have to be like, $1,000 equipment. Just use your phone. It doesn't even matter. Like, don't even overthink the whole horizontal and landscape and all that other kind of stuff. Like, you just want to get some stuff that'll help you promote the show. And you don't want to do it at the very end because you'll regret it because you won't have much, right? Any questions there?
So we do have one. Since most interviews are through Zoom now, how do you get pictures of guests for marketing? Because the Zoom box doesn't seem very interesting.
Yeah. In this space, I've actually been resorting to videos a little bit more, right? To kind of add a little bit more personality, because it's not so fun visually. I'd assume this is what I'm looking like on the screen right now. Like it's like not a fun visual unless it's like somebody known, right? So I have been for that reason more leaning into videos, but I also would say too that like capture some of that back and forth, right? Either record the entire thing and edit it down or whatever it is, but yeah, I would lean on video a little bit more.
Great.
So just
I've got one just came in that I think is good to ask now. Should we use the same artwork for every show or change it? This person currently uses their brand logo.
Every episode, or are there multiple shows and you want to know if you would put the brand bug basically on it?
Unclear.
Okay. So I would say that on the episode level, you want to actually be very careful on using the same asset every single time you promote a show. And a good example of that would be if you kind of use a link, like let's just say you use the Apple Podcast link, like in every single time you're going to promote an episode, it pulls in an image, right? It pulls in your show art, right? That's okay. Like that's okay a couple times, right? If that is the only thing you're doing every single time you're promoting an episode, people start to tune it out, right? Because they've seen that image and it's just, you get visual blindness, right? So on an episode level, I would say try to mix it up, right? Which is a little of what I'm trying to do, in some of these examples here, right? Where you get B-roll or you do quote cards or you do videos or whatever it is. So you kind of keep it kind of fresh. On the show level, I would say that like you don't want to confuse people by having it look too much the same, because it almost then they feel like, well, how is this different? Why would I listen to that show when it looks so similar to this other show I'm already listening to? But tie it together with like a brand bug or something, like yes, because if you do your job and are very concise and you're known for a certain sort of production as a producer, having like a cohesive sort of vision will help people be like, oh, if I like this, then I'm definitely going to like this, right? So you're kind of bringing that whole entire story sort of together.
Yes, and they were asking about on the episode level, should you have different artwork for each episode?
Yeah, try as much as you can. I will say that, like, you know, as somebody who, again, like when I was on an independent podcast producer, I didn't have necessarily like budgets to be doing like, you know, wild and wacky things. Like I didn't have, you know, budgets to kind of go back to a graphic designer every week and be like, oh, make this great thing. And so what I would do is try to figure out, like, is there a framework that I can work within to kind of keep those assets fresh? Can I design some sort of quote card where, again, I'm just changing the text? Or can I design some sort of graphic where there's like a frame that really kind of, you know, solidifies the branding of the show, but then what goes in the frame is different. So maybe I flip in guest pictures or like whatever it is, right? I have definitely learned over the years how to be hacky with it. But obviously, like if you have more resources, then yes, trying to devote time and effort into doing more episodic things is important because after a certain point, people just stop ignoring them. I mean, they stop paying attention to them rather.
Well, what about in the feed itself? So should you create a different piece of artwork for each episode within the feed, or are you talking about marketing, having different artwork for marketing each episode?
More marketing. I think that episodic art, when it comes to the podcasters, I think there's still some work to be done in terms of how people are surfacing those. And if I'm honest, I'm not sure that I think the ROI is great there yet. That said, though, could you do it because you're using it for marketing purposes and then use it in the feeds? Yes. But would I do it sheerly just to kind of in the feeds themselves? Honestly, no.
Okay. And you mentioned B-roll. Someone wants to know what that is.
Yeah, it's just like off the cuff sort of stuff, right? Like I think, you know, B-roll is actually it's kind of both good at the launch and also like deeper when you're building relationships, right? Like break out your bingo card. But the one thing that we all know, you know, in terms of, you know, being in podcasting is it's a very intimate medium, and that you develop these relationships with a host, right? And, you know, and I feel the same way, by the way. You know, the Slate Political Gab Fest that I talked about years ago, when I finally got to meet them, like, gosh, I think I'd been listening to them for 10 years on a professional level. I had to kind of keep my chill because I felt like they were my friends. I knew them for 10 years and I was like, ugh, don't make it awkward, Christy. And so B-roll, it's just kind of like those more off the cuff sort of moments that help deepen that relationship between the listener and actually the host, the actual, you know, the personality behind the podcast, right? People love that stuff, right? You have to think about like, you know, I don't know, some celebrity that you love. You don't want to see canned, you know, headshots and that kind of stuff, right? Like you love digging into more like the personalities of what happens when they're not on a movie set or when they're not on a, you know, studio or stage or like whatever it is, right? So could it be some sort of funny aside, you know, between the two hosts? Could it be like, you know, just behind the scene pictures like I have there with the Obamas, right? Whatever it is, it kind of, again, depends on like the flavor of the podcast. But yeah, it's just adding color and personality and deepening that relationship with the host.
Great. Well, we have lots more questions, but let's go back to the slides and then we'll circle back.
Okay. So just in terms of like other, you know, visual needs to kind of, you know, tie a bow on terms of like art, right, is that you don't want to just think about the key art and then be done, right? And especially on smaller budgets, what you want to do is kind of think about some of this stuff ahead of time and actually work with somebody or get this stuff designed all at the same time so you're not chasing your tail afterwards, right? It's not just the key art because, again, if you lean on that, people will start ignoring it, right? So are you going to need anything for the platforms? Are you going to need anything for your website? Because you can't just have like a 3,000 by 3,000 you know, like a square piece of art and then think you slap that up on a website and that's going to look good, right? Social media, again, like you have to kind of think about like, you know, what are the things you're going to be using on social media to kind of promote the show. And then of course there's audiograms and also video, right? So you're almost always going to need a 16:9 asset in some form or fashion, right? Because that's going to get you your Apple Flow case. It's going to get you your website hero image, and you can kind of use it in some hacky sort of ways on social media, including down to covers, right? Like a Twitter cover or whatnot, right? But I would just be thoughtful about that at the very beginning, because again, like the more you can kind of think about that, all of your different needs at the very beginning, the more efficient you are going to be with whatever budget you're working with when it comes to the look and feel of the show.
That was a 16:9 image, correct?
16:9, mm-hmm. Landscape, basically landscape, yeah.
And someone wants to know, how important is it to do a video trailer and not just an audio trailer at launch?
I would say very. That's one of the things, like I can only kind of speak for myself, but you know, as part of what we're doing at Sony Music is every single show that we have has some sort of visual trailer. Because again, like I know what social media is, right? And I know how to capture people's attention, and a video trailer with some sort of visual is going to grab people in. And I'll also say it kind of links into some questions I get often with audiograms, right? Which is, are audiograms great? And they are, by the way. I use them as well. I use them, you know, as well. Or what am I trying to say? I use them also. There we go. Depending on the format that you use with audiograms, though, literally anything you can do with a video that is like one step above an audiogram is going to increase your engagement on the actual video and then drive them to the podcast than an actual audiogram, right? An audiogram was something that was developed. It's a really great tool, but all it really does is basically turn an MP3 into an MP4, because that's how social media works, right? You can't upload an MP3 on Facebook. It does nothing, right? And so I think it's very useful, and actually having a video trailer where you put a little bit of elbow grease into it, which, linking back to the previous slide, means you got to get some stuff along the way to make it kind of visually appealing, is going to take you so much further than just having an audio trailer or just making like a very lackluster audiogram.
And do you have an example of a video trailer that you can point us towards?
I could follow up somehow. Maybe like, I don't know if there's a way to like send this out after, but I can definitely send you some. The one I really love that we made recently is Fake Priest. You can definitely Google Fake Priest. It's a show by Neon Hum. They had a lot of stuff for us to work with, actually, because they got a lot of stuff along the way when they were kind of going out and interviewing stuff. And so since I had a lot of really great material to work with, I think the trailer shows it. So yeah.
Great. I think people would love some links. And would you be able to share your slides as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great, I'll send those out for you. And someone already put a YouTube link in the chat, I see. So we have a follow-up question on that. Do you pay to boost those videos? And if yes, what's a good budget to allocate?
There's no right or wrong answer in terms of, and I say this like, I know it's a hard question. Like, obviously the budgets I'm working with as Sony Music are different than the budgets I was working with as an independent audio producer, right? And I just kind of know that going into it. And I think when I have not a lot of budget, I get real hacky and I am real pushy and I will not let things stop me and I go after organic hard, right? Whereas obviously when I'm at Sony Music, I do have healthier budgets to work with and I can kind of do things differently, right? So there's no right or wrong answer. There's no like, you must have a big budget in order to kind of succeed or whatever it is. You just got to kind of be real with what you have. I boosted stuff on Facebook for $5, right? Like, you just got to be careful, right? You don't want the $5 to kind of go everywhere. What you're going to do is you're going to say, I have $5 to spend to boost this video. I know I want to reach Susan. How am I going to reach Susan the most effective way possible? Don't reach everybody. You're going to get Susan somehow, some way, and that targeting on Facebook for that, that boosted post, right? Yeah, that's what I would say. Yes, I would do it, right? If you have the budget, like, I think it's a good idea, but in terms of how much, it just depends. So.
And someone's looking for a little clarity on audiogram. So when we're talking about audiogram, it's that, the MP4 file made from a piece of art and an MP3 audio. So it's not like you and I on this video, it's just a static piece of art with sound.
So there's a lot of companies that can kind of do this for you. Or if you're good with coding, actually, I think WNYC might have released like the open source code that you could, I don't know how to do this, but I know other people can, where you can almost just kind of generate your own sort of thing. But otherwise, like Headliner, that's the one that I use just because I've just used it over the years. And so you don't really need much to do it, right? You just need like some sort of image. You need the audio that you're going to kind of cut. It kind of goes off and it does its thing, right? And it's got the little waveform, you know what I mean, that goes along like the little picture and whatnot. And it is better than sometimes like even like a static image, right? But is any other video on top of that probably going to get you more bang for your buck? Yes, because at some point, like the little guy kind of like moving or whatever, it's not the most engaging thing, right? And especially if you're doing it, I'll kind of also link it back to the episode question, which is if you're using that same audiogram sort of template every single week to promote your show, people stop paying attention. And so that's why I feel like, videos, and also why you want to try to get some stuff out of the episodes and try to get videos out of the episodes, whether you're taping the Zooms, whether you're trying to get something like, like in the field or whatever it is. It all goes back to how can you kind of keep refreshing, your look and feel so that people are engaged and you're bringing new people into the show along the way.
Can you explain for our audience what does go after organic hard mean?
Yeah. Let's see what comes next. Am I going to go into, I think I am.
Great.
So I'm going to kind of go into that, right? Because again, I don't want it to seem like just because I'm at Sony Music that I don't understand how hard it is when you're working with like small budgets or honestly no budgets, which I've done before as well. So when I'm trying to think about a show, and again, I don't care if it's when I'm an independent or when I'm at Sony, I really actually try to think like, what are the buckets that I can lean into? And so audience development, when you break it down at its very basic level, is there's 3 buckets. There's owned, earned, and paid. You're not you're lucky if you can kind of tap into all three and like knock it out of the park, right? Usually there's like one that's kind of working better for you, you know, and you just kind of have to like know your own sort of show. But you got to figure out what you can kind of play into, what you can kind of lean into, and what you're going to have to kind of augment. And so to kind of tie it all together before I go into like the sort of like specific examples is my little case study there about Michael's having a sale on yarn, right? If Michael's is having a sale on yarn, you know, the low hanging fruit way that they could actually just kind of tell people like, hey, our yarn is on sale is by just putting a sign like in the store and being like, hey, everybody, our yarn's on sale. But if they have a lot of yarn, well, that's not really gonna like get them to like, you know, sell all the yarn, right? Because they're only reaching people that are in that store when that sale is actually going on that actually happen to go into the yarn aisle, right? And there's probably a lot of other people in the world that wish that they knew that there was like this ridiculous sale on like yarn, right? And so, you know, is it maybe that there's a going out of sale, you know, like maybe Michael's is going, I don't know, out of business, right? And they just need to get rid of all their yarn, right? Is there any press hits they can get out of that sort of thing? Could you actually do a paid campaign, right? And actually target people that, I don't know, this is where the yarn thing breaks down because I don't do things with yarn, but like, I don't think you crochet with yarn, but we're going to pretend that you do.
You do, you could crochet with yarn, yes.
There you go, all right. So, you know, could you actually do a paid campaign on Facebook where you're reaching people that actually crochet with yarn that happen to live in DMAs, which is like a marketing term, which are like city sort of limits. DMAs where there's a Michael's, right? But the point is though, is that you can't just kind of, if you're trying to do your job as a marketer, you kind of can't live in any bucket alone, but you also have to be smart about the bucket that you can actually own. Meaning that, like, for example, when I've worked on shows I have no budget, I'm not going to really pay attention to that paid bucket because I can't, right? And so when I say, and I'll kind of go over some examples in terms of, you know, going hard on organic, I lean much more into owned and I lean much more into earned, right? To try to figure out what I can do to push the needle there. I might skip this because it doesn't really relate to the question, but sometimes I get questions about like what kind of budgets I need to be thinking about for marketing. So
we've definitely got some questions about that in the box. So
all right, well then I'll just kind of keep going the way that I have this laid out. So the way that I kind of think about it is, again, I'm not going to give a solid number. There is no right or wrong budget number at all. Again, I've worked with them all and I've been able to get success on like almost every single budget that I've had, whether it's like, you know, $5 or whether it's a lot more, you know, with what I'm working with now. But what I would say that I do think about though is, you know, I'm basically kind of in the customer acquisition game for ears, right? I am trying to get ears, right? And I'm trying to buy ears, right? Like that's kind of what I'm doing at the end of the day. And so having, you know, done this for a while, what I can tell you is that the hardest thing to kind of do, or where you need the biggest budget, is usually short run fiction. And it's not to say that there is not a robust community, and I'm very familiar with it, and I love that it exists. There's not a robust community of like, you know, the medium sort of fiction shows. It's just through the years, it's just one of those things I've seen where the cost per acquisition, so the cost per ear, is higher on short run fiction than it is on almost anything else that I've done. And so when I'm thinking about like what budget I'm assigned to all of our different shows, I think about short run, long run, and then fiction and nonfiction, and then I kind of mix them all up. So on the more expensive side, again, you've got your short run fiction, and then on the sort of, you know, I don't want to say cheaper, but like, you know, you get a little bit more bang for your buck, is more the long run, weekly sort of nonfiction sort of shows. You can also go slower, right? Like I think the thing that's a little hard about short run shows is, especially if you're trying to monetize it, you don't have time to kind of grow your audience along the way. You kind of have to hit it right out of the gate to kind of fulfill your advertiser obligations. Where with the ongoing shows, like you can do a lot of trial and error. You can start off small as long as you kind of like understand that and are okay with it. You can start off small and grow organically kind of like along the way. And do a lot of testing and whatnot to get there. So it's just, they're just kind of two different launch strategies, I think, between a short run show and an ongoing show. I'm assuming there's questions.
Makes sense. Nothing specific to that. So I would say keep going on there.
All right. I feel like this is not going to answer the question. Give me some more questions in terms of the organic stuff.
Okay. Organic stuff. Lots of questions about cross-promotional platforms like Podcorn for sponsorships and Audrey for other podcasters. You know, what do you recommend? What's meaningful and what's a waste of time, frankly?
I don't know that I found anything that's like a waste of time. Like I wouldn't say like, don't use X sort of platform. Like I've used platform. I haven't used Audrey, so I can't really speak one way or the other. But yeah, I can't tell you that there's anything that's a waste of time other than there's this, I'll say one, again, I kind of always go back to remember the fundamentals. You have to make sure that whatever you're doing actually goes back to your audience avatar, right? But the other thing that I find, which is actually a waste of time, it's not platform specific, is that sometimes I feel like people get very literal with other shows that they might want to work with. And what I mean by that is if you have you have a yarn show, it's the yarn show. And all you're doing is going after and trying to work with or buy ads on or guest on or whatever, or other yarn shows, you're probably limiting yourself because I actually probably can't speak for almost everyone on this call that like, you don't just listen to one kind of podcast, right? I probably have 25 that I listen to on like a rotating basis and they're all over the place. I am equally as happy listening to the Daily as I am about the Trader Joe's podcast, which by the way, I will tell everybody is delightful because there's no stakes, right? So like that's how people listen, right? And so if you're so hard on like on only going after like true crime, and then you're only going after other true crime shows, you're actually probably missing like a wide swath of people that still want to know about your show. So you have to like really think through like, yes, I know the audience avatar, but your audience avatar, if you do your job, you're building out that profile so you understand that she doesn't just listen to true crime. She also listens to yarn shows. She probably also goes to Michael's. She probably also goes to Trader Joe's. And so these are all different touch points that you can think about in terms of these audio ads and the cross programs and whatnot that are not so like one-to-one, because that's the kind of stuff that drives me nuts. I mean, I literally just had an example last week on one of my shows that I was able to prove through Chartable, where we did a cross promo, and it was the thing that I probably thought would work the least, and it worked the best. It was not a one-to-one correlation. I'm not going to give you the example, but it was not a one-to-one correlation, and it kind of proves my point that like being so specific sometimes you cut off your nose to spite your face, basically. So yeah, I don't know that answered the platform question, but again, I don't know that I think there are any that I haven't tested. So
yeah, and people did want a little bit more detail about Chartable and how you're using that.
I feel like my team just hears me say Chartable like over and over and over again because I am just so excited, honestly, that there's marketing attribution in this space now, which has not been a thing. And so a lot of times, like I'll done things, and if I'm launching a new show, it's really hard to tell what worked, right? Because you launch everything and you line everything up at launch because you want to kind of come out of the gate with a bang, which is great, and you should do it. But then, I'd say like even 3 years ago, if I had 10 cross promos running on the same day, plus I had audio buys, plus I had a Facebook campaign, and maybe I did some display stuff, I do absolutely not know what actually drove the traffic to the podcast, right? And so the reason I'm so, excited about Chartable is that I actually can tell things are working, right? And I can also tell some stuff that's not working. Like I had another surprise this morning with somebody on my team who, is kind of looking at the data, and I was like, wow, I am shocked by that. Like I am actually genuinely surprised that didn't work. It's a contextual fit. Our audience avatars listening to it checks all the boxes, but it didn't work, right? And so that's where I get really excited about that, because I literally have not had that for most of my podcast career, right? And it's powerful. That is powerful information, especially if you're working on more than one show. So
good to know. Yeah. There's some questions about sponsorships, but I feel like it's a little off topic here. One question
might not be, though. I will say, like, I was thinking about like organic and like leaning into it. I think you have to be, this is where I've actually made a lot of, I think inroads on shows where I actually don't have a budget, right? Or I have like a really small budget, right? Which is how can I partner with people that are really, really like what I'm doing, and I can provide some value to them, and then I can get access to their audience, right? Like how can I somehow make it a win-win for both sides? And that works whether you're talking about co-marketing, or it also actually works for sponsorship for podcasts where you might not necessarily have access to like the bigger sort of ad buying networks, right? So I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but what I think about is I think about my audience avatar, right? Or avatars, as so to speak, and like, what are the things that they're sort of interested in, right? What are the sort of brands? What are the sort of, places they're spending time with? And then I try to come up with a really compelling pitch as to why those brands, places, people, whatever it is, should work with me on the podcast, right? It doesn't cost any money, right? You just have to it's a lot of legwork because you have to be very concise with how you actually want to make that pitch, right? Because you're asking for something back. But that is when I say lean into hard and organic, man, I go hard on the partnerships, like pretty robustly. So.
And then there's a lot of questions about, is doing something once a week or every other week, once a month, is there any sort of guide for, the release of the episodes, and then any guide on the length of the episodes when it comes to thinking about marketing?
Yeah. You want to set up a regular schedule, right? That's like that. The humans are creatures of habit. And what you want people to get annoyed if you skip a week, right? Like that's a good thing because that means people are so into the show that they're mad when you went away. Yeah, having some sort of regular schedule that you kind of commit to is important. And if you deviate from it, it's not to say that you can't, right? People need to take breaks and there's holidays and there's like whatever, but equally as important. And I've actually seen this in the data where if you do not walk your audience through what is going on with those breaks or like whatever it is, or the switches, your listenership is actually going to suffer. Respect your audience, respect the relationship that you built with them, and come back at regular intervals because that's what people want basically. So, length, honestly, it's all over the board. I can even say this for my time at Stitcher, you know what I mean? Where I was more actually on the app side. And so I saw a lot of like really interesting patterns. For every rule that I give you in terms of like what the length of the show could be, I could tell you like literally 5 different outliers of like, infamously Joe Rogan, 3 hours, 4 hours an episode, like what? And it's the biggest podcast out there, right? So I will tell you though that, that podcast lengths have been dropping over the years. And right now, I think on average, they're harboring a little over about a half an hour. And conceptually, that makes sense to me because you know what? If you look into people's commutes, which are, by the way, that's something you can Google. And I have before I had like a research and insights team where you can Google it. People's commutes are around a half an hour, right? So like that kind of makes sense to me in terms of what we know about listening habits, which you can also get from share of ear, that you're kind of seeing those two things kind of start hewing close together.
There's a question about, in terms of gathering your own share of ear, can independent podcasts compete with all these celebrity-driven podcasts?
Yes. I fundamentally believe that, even coming from Sony Music, I fundamentally believe that. Are you going to, maybe necessarily be as big as Joe Rogan? No. Do I think that that's like that shouldn't be your goal, right? Your goal should be making a really, really awesome show for the audience that you think you're going to try to go after, right? And in that way, I do think that there's always going to be a space for independence, right? Because it's a different game. You're trying to go after a different audience and design different programming for independence. So it does mean you have to get hacky though, right? I kind of keep going back to that of like, you're not going to be operating with the same budgets that the bigger guys are, right? And so that's why I have not, and I know a lot of other independent producers in the space because I like talking to people a lot, right? Like you just, you have to really lean into the stuff that will work for you, right? Do you have any platforms? Like when I talked about that, that section where it was like owned, earned, and paid, right? If you're a smaller show, again, paid is a little rocky, right? Like you might have to kind of put that bucket aside for a little bit, right? What platforms do you have access to? Is it your personal platform? Do you know anybody in your circle that actually has a platform that might be willing to kind of hand the microphone to you for a little bit, right? What sort of partnerships can you kind of get into that, like, again, you're trying to make it like such a great fit that they can't say no or whatever it is, right? I lean a lot into that more when I don't have budgets and I don't have like celebrities or like whatever it is. But again, it's just kind of playing to your strengths, like, you know what I mean? Because I can also say the flip side of like at Sony, right? I'm much more about earned and paid, right? So yeah.
Great. Well, we're coming to the end here. I don't know if you want to say anything else on your slides before I toss a final question at you.
That's actually my deck. Other than, I am around. I love talking about this stuff all the time. I'm pretty easily reachable. So, people can reach me at, I'll probably give my personal address. So you can reach me at christy.mirabal@gmail.com. I'm always happy to kind of answer questions as time allows. So, about, just marketing and also honestly, just the Podcast Academy, which is like a little bit of a passion project of mine. So.
Yes, definitely. Well, thanks. I think we got a lot of good information here. One final question is, how do you calculate ROI for marketing? It's a big question, I know.
That's why I like Chartable, right? Because it's actually one of the first times where I'm like, oh, I can actually see like, what is actually sort of working. If one hacky thing that I've done before, on long running shows, because I was literally just trying to figure out like what was moving the needle and what wasn't, is starting to do discrete, small little experiments, right? It's hard to do on a short run show. So you really kind of, I feel like it's better in a long run show and divorced from launch, because there's so much activity around launch that like, it muddies the whole waters, right? But like I've done like small little spends on like Facebook, right? Like we're in a very specific DMA. that I can actually track on like Megaphone, which is like a posting platform that I've used over the years, right? And so if I do like this little spend on Facebook and this specific city, I can then actually go back on the Megaphone and see, did that thing actually just in that city actually make it go up? And I've been able to do that for like 15 bucks. And if I can actually say that like that $15 spend that I did, and then I saw the listens, well, that makes me feel a lot more confident that I'm actually going to pony up dough, you know, and do something that's like 200 or 500 or whatever it is, right? But doing very, very small, concise experiments and trying to use the little data that you actually get from RSS feeds to work to your benefit, that's how I actually have been able to prove stuff in the past, right? Same thing of like, you know, if you have any questions about like pre-chartable, right? If a cross promo actually sort of worked, right? I would just don't line up a bunch, right? Just do the one and then kind of go back and see like, did it work, right? Like try to make it so that you're only doing one thing at a time so you can measure it and then iterate from there. That's about the best way I can do it, and you know, without like the chartables of the world.
Well, thank you so much for all that fantastic and quick information. We will put the video up later this week, and I will work on getting it transcribed. And we will send out some links to some video promos that Christy recommends, as well as a copy of her deck. So thanks for joining us today, and spread the word on the Podcast Academy. Everyone have a great afternoon. Take care.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.